You move through the world as if it were something happening to you, as if reality were a stage set in front of your eyes, and you somehow were separate from it, watching, judging, surviving. This feels natural, obvious, sensible. And that is precisely why Alan Watts would say it is the most convincing illusion you will ever live inside. From the moment you learn to speak, you learn to divide. You learn to say me and world, mind and matter, inside and outside. Language trained you to believe that consciousness is trapped behind your eyes, looking out at a universe that exists independently of you. But Watts insisted that this way of seeing is not truth. It is a habit. A deeply reinforced misunderstanding dressed up as common sense. You don't experience reality directly. You experience a translation of it. Colors are not out there. They are how your nervous system interprets light. Sounds are not floating through space. They are how your ears and brain convert vibration into meaning. Even the feeling of being a separate self is not something you discovered. It is something you were taught to assume. Watts would smile at this and say, "You are not in the universe the way a thing is in a box. You are something the universe is doing, right where you are." This is where most people quietly resist him. Because if that is true, then the story of control collapses. The idea that you are a lonely thinker inside a fragile body, struggling against an external world, begins to look artificial. Watts wasn't trying to comfort you with this observation. He was dismantling a psychological posture that generates constant anxiety. When you believe you are separate, you feel perpetually threatened. Life becomes a problem to solve instead of a process to participate in. Notice how relentlessly you try to secure yourself against uncertainty. Plans, identities, beliefs, achievements, these become armor. But Watts would point out something unsettling. The more you try to pin reality down, the more tense and unreal it feels. Because reality is not a thing, it is an event, it is movement, it is happening, not had. And the self you are trying to protect is part of that same movement, not an observer standing outside of it. This is why Watts often compared the universe to music. You don't listen to music to get to the final note. If you did, the fastest song would be the best song. You listen for the experience of the unfolding. In the same way, life is not a journey toward a conclusion. It is a play of patterns expressing themselves moment by moment. When you treat it like a task with a final payoff, you miss the point while obsessing over the end. Most people never realize this because the ego depends on the illusion of separation to survive. The ego wants a center, a controller, a me who is in charge. Watts didn't deny that this sense of self exists. He questioned its authority. He suggested that the ego is more like a useful fiction, a social convenience, than the ruler of reality. And when you see that, even briefly, something loosens. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, unmistakable shift. You may feel it as a soft suspicion that you are not as trapped as you thought. That the boundary between you and everything else is thinner than you were taught to believe. Watts would say that this is not enlightenment. It is simply noticing what has always been the case. The universe is not confronting you. It is expressing itself as you, just as it expresses itself as trees, oceans, stars, and passing thoughts. Before you move on, sit with this question, not to answer it, but to feel it. What if the self you're defending is not who you really are? If this resonates, comment this phrase below. I am not separate from what I experience. Not. And if you want to continue exploring ideas that quietly dismantle the way you've been taught to see reality, subscribe now. If the first illusion is separation, the second is control. Once you believe you are a separate self, you immediately assume you must manage reality, steer it, fix it, secure it, bend it towards safety. Alan Watts saw this as the hidden engine behind most human suffering. Not pain itself, but the compulsive attempt to dominate a process that was never meant to be controlled. Look closely at how often you say, "I should be further ahead. I need to figure this out. I can't lose control." These thoughts feel responsible, even virtuous. But Watts would quietly ask, who is the controller here? Where exactly is this entity that stands apart from life and directs it like a machine? When you search for it, you don't find a commander. You find more thoughts, more sensations, more reactions. Control turns out to be another story layered on top of experience, not a force operating outside it. This is why Watts spoke so often about the paradox of effort. The harder you try to calm your mind, the louder it becomes. The more you try to be spontaneous, the more forced you feel. Trying to let go becomes just another form of grasping. Watts wasn't mocking this contradiction. He was pointing to something fundamental. You cannot use willpower to escape the illusion of willpower. The very act of trying assumes the separate self is real. Consider breathing. You can control your breath for a while, but only because the body already knows how to breathe without you. If you had to consciously manage every inhale, you would not survive the day. Watts used this as a quiet metaphor. Most of reality is functioning perfectly well without your supervision. The problem begins when the mind insists on taking credit or responsibility for processes far larger than itself. This is where fear sneaks in. If you believe you are in charge, then failure becomes personal. Uncertainty becomes dangerous. Change becomes a threat. Watts suggested that anxiety is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a natural consequence of believing you are a fragile controller in an uncontrollable world. When that belief loosens, anxiety doesn't vanish, but it loses its authority. It stops dictating your relationship with reality. Notice how society rewards the illusion of control. We admire certainty, decisiveness, rigid identities. We ask children what they want to be, as if life were a fixed destination rather than a continuous unfolding. Watts saw this as a cultural hypnosis. We are trained to live as if we were nouns instead of verbs, static entities rather than dynamic events. But reality does not behave like a solid object. It behaves like a dance. And in a dance, no one is in control in the way we imagine. There is coordination, responsiveness, rhythm, but not domination. When you try to dominate the dance, you step on toes. When you listen and respond, the movement carries you. This does not mean passivity. Watts was careful about that. He wasn't telling people to withdraw from life or abandon responsibility. He was pointing to a different quality of action, one that arises from participation rather than resistance, action without the psychological tension of needing to secure an imaginary self. You may notice moments when this happens naturally. When you are absorbed in conversation, art, sport, or deep attention, the sense of a separate controller fades. Things happen through you rather than by you. Watts would say those moments are not special states. They are glimpses of how reality always works when the ego stops interrupting. This realization unsettles most people because it removes the illusion of absolute control, but it also removes the burden of pretending to have it. You are not failing at control. Control was never the point. Pause with this idea and notice what resists it inside you. That resistance is not an enemy. It is the ego trying to remain necessary. If this struck something true, comment this phrase: "Control is an illusion I no longer need." And if you're still here, subscribe, because what comes next cuts even deeper into how you experience time, meaning, and identity. Once the illusion of control weakens, something even more unsettling begins to surface: the illusion of time. Alan Watts understood that most people do not live in the present moment, not because they are distracted, but because they believe the present is merely a thin bridge between a remembered past and an imagined future. And that belief quietly drains life of its substance. You think of now as a fleeting instant that immediately disappears, something to be used, endured, or sacrificed for what comes next. Watts would say, this is one of the strangest ideas humans have ever agreed upon. Because when you look closely, the past exists only as memory happening now, and the future exists only as anticipation happening now. The present is not a point in time. It is the only place where time appears at all. This is why chasing fulfillment in the future never quite works. You tell yourself that once a condition is met, more money, clarity, recognition, security, life will finally begin. But when that moment arrives, it arrives as another now, carrying the same structure as the moment you were trying to escape. Watts saw this as a cosmic joke the ego plays on itself, postponing aliveness while waiting for life to start. He wasn't suggesting that planning is wrong. He was pointing out a deeper confusion, mistaking abstract time for lived reality. Clocks are useful tools, but they are not descriptions of experience. No one has ever lived in the past or the future. You have only ever lived here. And yet, most suffering comes from treating mental images as if they were more real than the present experience supporting them. Notice how often your attention drifts away from what is happening in favor of what should be happening. Even joy becomes anxious when you're aware it will end. Watts would say, this is the ego trying to secure continuity, trying to freeze the dance into a permanent pose. But impermanence is not a flaw in reality. It is the condition that allows anything to appear at all. This is where Watts' view becomes especially radical. He suggested that meaning is not something life is moving toward, it is something life is expressing. Just as a flower does not bloom in order to justify itself, your existence does not need an external purpose to be valid. The demand for ultimate meaning, Watts argued, often hides a refusal to trust the present moment as sufficient. This doesn't mean life is meaningless. It means meaning is not an object you possess. It is a relationship you participate in. When you stop asking, what is this all for, and start noticing, what is this like, something subtle but profound shifts. Experience regains its texture. Colors sharpen, sounds feel closer. Even ordinary moments begin to carry weight, not because they promise something later, but because they are fully themselves. Watts often warned that spiritual ideas can become just another escape from the present. Chasing enlightenment, awakening, or transcendence as future achievements is no different from chasing status or security. It keeps you oriented toward an imagined finish line. The irony, he said, is that what you're seeking is already the condition of your seeking itself. This realization doesn't arrive with fireworks, it arrives quietly, often disguised as simplicity. Nothing dramatic changes, and yet everything feels less strained. You stop bracing for the next moment. You stop treating time like an enemy. You begin to sense that life is not rushing past you. It is unfolding as you. Let this question sit without answering it. If the present moment is all there ever is, what have you been postponing? If this resonates, comment this phrase, now is not a bridge, it is the place I live. And if you're still following, subscribe, because the final layer Alan Watts revealed brings all of this into a single, unavoidable conclusion. When the illusions of separation, control, and time begin to dissolve, one final resistance usually remains. It is subtle, deeply ingrained, and rarely questioned, the belief that life is something you must justify, that your existence needs a reason, an achievement, or a narrative that proves it was worth happening. Alan Watts understood that this belief quietly underlies much of human restlessness. From early on, you are taught to earn your place, to become someone, to make your life add up to something recognizable. Watts did not deny the beauty of creation, contribution, or growth, but he challenged the hidden assumption beneath them, that without a resume, life is somehow incomplete. He would say this is like asking a wave to explain why it rises or a cloud to justify its shape. The universe, Watts insisted, is not a moral accountant. It does not demand that you prove your value before participating. Trees do not apologize for growing. Stars do not worry about significance. They express what they are, because expression is what existence does. And you are not an exception to this pattern. You are an expression of it. This is where his insight becomes unavoidable. If you are not separate from reality, if you are not its controller, and if you have never lived anywhere but now, then the idea of a life that must be earned begins to collapse. You are not here on probation. You are not a mistake waiting to be corrected. You are the universe experiencing itself from a particular point of view. For many people, this is uncomfortable, not because it is frightening, but because it removes a familiar tension. The ego thrives on the sense that something is missing. It needs a problem to solve, a future to secure, a self to defend. When those demands relax, there can be a moment of disorientation. Watts would say this is not confusion, it is freedom without instructions. This does not mean that suffering disappears or that choices no longer matter. It means they are no longer carried by the weight of existential justification. You act, not to prove your worth, but because action arises naturally from being alive. You care, not because meaning is scarce, but because connection is inherent. Watts often described this realization as a kind of cosmic humor. The punchline is not that life is absurd, but that it was never as serious as we thought. Seriousness, he suggested, is the mask fear wears when it tries to look responsible. When that mask slips, what remains is not chaos, but play. Not randomness, but rhythm. If you listen carefully, this understanding doesn't shout, it whispers. It shows up as a lighter grip on identity, a quieter relationship with outcomes, a sense that even uncertainty belongs. You stop asking reality to reassure you and start noticing that it never stopped supporting you. This is what most people never realize. They are waiting for permission to be alive while life is already happening through them. There is nothing to arrive at, nothing to complete, nothing to fix before you belong. And perhaps the deepest shift is this. When you stop trying to stand outside the universe and judge it, you realize you were never outside to begin with. Sit with this final phrase, not as a belief, but as a recognition. You are not in the world. You are what the world is doing where you are. If this landed for you, comment this phrase, I no longer need to justify my existence. And if this way of seeing changed something subtle but real inside you, subscribe and stay.